Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School, and in this tutorial we're going to go over basic workshop items. So when I say basic workshop item, I'm making the distinction between those that you just place them down and they exist, things like walls or simple pieces of furniture that your settlers can sit on, or desks or decorations, things that don't have interactivity necessarily to them. So ones that I would consider more advanced workshop items would be things like the shop stalls, turrets, generators, any item that involves power, and we'll cover that stuff in a future video. And what I want to do here is help those of you who went through the CK102 video and learned how to make new objects to be able to make those buildable in workshop mode. This is also going to teach you how to take existing items in the game and make those buildable. And so once you have that ability to make those constructible items in workshop mode, that we'll build on that in the future when I show you those more advanced workshop objects, and it probably will give you guys, a lot of you guys, the information you need to proceed forward with just this basic tutorial. So the goal is not to make all of the tutorials an hour long like the first couple were. I am going to try and do some shorter ones like this so that you guys can get that information and get out of there and get to work and make something cool. So we're going to start off by saying I am assuming at this point you at least understand camera movement, and that you know how to create a plugin, and that you know how to open forms, edit forms, and create new forms. You'll end up seeing me do some of this stuff, and I'll try and talk my way through it since this is one of our earlier tutorials. But for the most part, you don't need a ton of prerequisite knowledge to get through this tutorial. All right, so I am going to use the 101 test plugin that I did where I built an outhouse. So if you don't have this, don't worry about it. You can use absolutely any static object for this particular tutorial. So if you don't have the outhouse, or if you do have the outhouse, or rather whatever you built during that tutorial, just some special item you built out of a static collection from the CK102 tutorial if you did it. If not, then just find an item you like and that you'd like to be able to build in workshop mode and just bring it up here. So the first thing we're going to do is prepare our item to make sure that we can build it in workshop mode. So I'm going to assume for now that you are creating a custom item. Now, if you're not doing that, if you're creating your own, you're going to want to create a copy of a custom item or of a vanilla item and build with that. So that you're going to be editing it. And like I said, all of my tutorials are going to be built around trying to teach you not to do vanilla edits, even though you can technically. It's just bad practices in modding. So for those of you not catching up from your CK102 tutorial and you're using a vanilla item, just right click on that vanilla item and hit duplicate so that you have a copy to work with. All right, so now once you've got your item open, whether it be a static collection, which is what I'm going to do, because static collections are wonderful in that they're usable on all platforms. So they're usable even for PS4 users, assuming you built all the pieces that you used came from the base game. And the other thing is that they don't require extra space. So if you look at this model file here, this path, that doesn't actually exist unless you hit recreate and if. And if you don't do that, this is actually kind of a virtual file name, and it doesn't actually have to exist, which means that when you release your plugin, it can be much smaller. It can be just the one file, just your ESP file. And these static collections exist within that anyway. So these are great if you've got them available to build with. There are definitely times when you can't do that, and that's going to be covered in more of the advanced workshop item stuff. All right, so let's assume you've got your 102 static collection up. So a couple of things need to happen to make sure that you can use this successfully in workshop mode. So the first up is you need to have a display name. Without a display name, the object will not be selectable when we get to the constructible object stage, which you'll understand what that means in a second. So just know you should have a display name. The other reason to have a display name is that this is what will show up when the player mouses over or highlights over with a controller. If they highlight over it with their cursor in workshop mode, they will get this name displayed so they can see what exactly it is. So I'm going to just name this outhouse. And we're going to skip these particular things here. We'll cover those in a later tutorial. We're not going to use filter string. And if you're using a normal static, and I'm going to just bring up my static version as well, just so you guys can follow along if you're not doing a static collection. You still have the exact same display name field, so I'll just fill that out just so you can follow that along. Again, we're going to skip all these checkboxes. We'll deal with that stuff at a later date. But another field that both of these have in common is the preview transform. So the preview transform is what determines how this object will show up in the build menu. So you've got that the little green stripe across the bottom of your screen in workshop mode that shows a little preview of the items. Obviously, all those items are different sizes, yet they show up approximately the same size in your preview so that you can see them, and they all have kind of an interesting angle to them, and that's done with the preview transform. So the easiest way I find to do these is to just use Bethesda's vanilla ones. And I like to just start with the biggest one possible and then shrink it down accordingly. And you'll start to learn which ones work best for different size items. So what you want to do in the preview transform is start typing the word workshop. So if you click on any drop-down menu in the creation kit and you start typing in a word, it will jump to that location. It makes it a lot faster to find specific stuff. So we're going to go to one of the bigger ones, which is workshop junk wall. And let me see if I can find that here, and I might have the name not quite. Yep, there it is. So if we go to the biggest one I find, excuse me, is workshop junk wall gate. So I tend to like to start with that one, and then I see what my object looks like, and if it doesn't match up well, then I'll pick a smaller item. The other way you can go about this is you can find these particular objects and go into a cell in here and place yours and place theirs and find one that's similar in size. That's another way you can go about it. But essentially, if you start with something larger and then work your way back toward that, you'll eventually find one that works well for it. So I'm going to just start with that. Again, you can do the same thing on a normal static. You click on this preview transform, start typing in workshop. One of the things that's very misleading is this preview window. So that size that it's showing things is not representative of how big it's going to actually be inside the game. It's very difficult to find an accurate representation in the creation kit, which is very unfortunate for this particular part of modding, but you tend to have to do a lot of trial and error to find one that looks good, and that's why I'm recommending you just start with something big, or again, you could also just start with something that's similar in size. You'll learn a workflow that works best for you, but just know that you're going to want a preview transform. And the other nice thing about these workshop ones is that they are all set to that pseudo angle where they're kind of on from an angle, so where you're looking just slightly above on them and kind of at one of the front type corners, and so you get kind of a nice consistent look on your object as all of the others. So once you've got the display name set and you've got the preview transform set, you're going to go ahead and hit OK on your item. And now it's ready to have a constructible object built. So to get a constructible object, you're going to expand the items category. So if you go into your object window and you're going to hit the little plus sign next to items if it's not hit already, and you're going to click on constructible object. Next, we're going to right click in the right hand side of the object window and choose new while you have constructible object open, and it will bring up a new constructible object form. And this thing is intimidating, and there's a lot of data you've got to fill out, and that's why I'm limiting this tutorial to just simple workshop items, because there's enough information here you're going to have to pick up. So as always, we're going to start with our prefix. So just anything you can identify your item and find it with. Now here, this is a personal preference and something you can decide how you want to do, but Bethesda does it, and I think it's very smart, is for the constructible objects, what they recommend you do, and I do as well, is to start out with CO for constructible object, then another underscore, and then just use either the exact name or most of the name of the actual object you're going to make constructible so that you can identify it later. So what I'm going to do is just name this kgtest underscore CO for constructible object underscore outhouse scall, because that's the object I'm actually going to have this particular record build. So before we go any further, the point of these constructible objects is basically to take your item, tell the game that it's buildable. You get to set up in this how many components it requires, so the cost it requires in workshop mode. In this, you get to set up things like where it shows up in the menu. Here you get to set up things like which types of settlements it's buildable in. So you'll notice that there's a lot of things you can't build at home plate, so you get to set up that kind of thing. You also get to set up the sounds that happen when you pick up and set the item down. And finally, you can set up conditions. So for example, of conditions, think about the artillery. You don't get that initially, you have to unlock it, and this is how you would lock down particular workshop items. So we'll go over all those particular things, but that's the overall purpose of this constructible object record. It's to take the thing you want to make buildable and then set up all the details that it means to be buildable. So the first and the most important thing to set up is to actually select your object from this created object drop-down menu. So I believe the filter works in here, but there are some windows in the creation kit where the filter does not work correctly, which is very unfortunate. But we're going to go ahead and type in our prefix And we're going to pull this menu down. Yes, it does work in here. Thank God. Whenever the filter menu doesn't work on one of these, it requires then you to just manually start typing in the name and hope for the best. So the filters are always the best. So we're going to filter for our prefix. And once you start getting more items, you might want to filter for more than that. And if you're ever uncertain of the exact name of your thing, you always have the option of putting in an asterisk and then part of it. So like if I wasn't sure how I named it, putting in that asterisk basically says anything in between there. So this could match KG test, big outhouse, little outhouse, or just outhouse. It would match all of them. So that star just means can be anything. So we find our SQL object here, our static collection. This one here, created object count, you always want that to be 1 with workshop items. It would get really awkward if you put that to more than 1. This particular field, or rather this particular record, the constructible object type, is also used for things like crafting. So things like cooking and whatnot, where there's a chance you might want the crafting to actually produce multiple items, and that's really what that field's for. The priority has to do with what order the objects exist in the build menu. So by default, they're sorted, I want to say alphabetically within the same and by plugin order. So for example, all of the objects that are in the base game, if they have priority 0, would all be sorted amongst themselves alphabetically. And then if you want to go outside of that, you can set the priority. And so the higher the number, the closer to the left, or the further to the left, that particular object will appear in the build menu. So this can be useful if you're trying to set up your items in a particular order. For example, with Sim Settlements, we have it so that the residential plot shows up first by upping this priority value. All right, the next thing that's fairly important is to set up the workbench keyword, and this determines which types of settlements you can build in. So we're going to do the trick where you click on a drop-down menu and start typing in. So we're going to type in workshop as our word, and then if you just scroll down a little bit, there's a lot of workshop things here. You could also type in the full workshop W. Another thing to note with this, the typing while you have a drop-down menu selected, as soon as you stop typing, so if you're not a quick typer, this isn't going to be the best system for you, but as soon as you stop typing, it resets. And so like if I were to try, so right now I typed in workshop W, if I were to try and continue to type in more letters to continue to narrow it down, because I waited so long, it would start with that letter again. So for example, I typed in workshop W, and now if I added an O, it's going to jump up to the O's. So it loses track of what I last typed. And you can kind of see that it's doing that because if you watch real closely, you might have to squint your eyes real close. But as I'm typing, you'll see there's a little tiny line appearing next to the letters I'm typing. And after I pause for a second, that little tiny cursor disappears. And that's telling you that it's done monitoring for keystrokes to determine where it should jump to in the list. All right, so you're going to find all of these workshop workbench options, and these are the things that you're going to use for buildable objects in workshop mode. There's a different set of workbench keywords you will use if you're making objects that can be crafted, but for things that are built in the workshop, they're all under workshop workbench. Now there's a few different types, and not all of them are super useful. It looks to me, by looking through these and understanding all the system that actually exists in the game, that Bethesda had originally planned on having a wider variety of types of settlements, but at the end they settled on just a few different types. So they've got, there's a few here you can use, and you're just going to choose the one that's most relevant, and I'm going to explain what each of these types do. So crafting is going to be for the workbenches. So that's going to be generally for if you're making a custom workbench. Obviously, we're not doing that right now, so we're going to skip that one. Decorations are the things that should be buildable in basically any settlement. So they should be buildable in your houses. They should be buildable in your interior workshops, in your exterior workshops. And the difference between an interior and an interior example would be something like Home Plate or Vault 88, whereas an exterior would be something like Sanctuary. It's out in the open world, and so there's a difference in those. Exterior is only going to be available in settlements that are outdoors, so that's going to be, again, types like Sanctuary would be a good example. Furniture are generally objects that people sit on or sleep on or interact with in some way, so these are going to be things that either the player or settlers will interact with. And then interior only, this is basically never used, but it's something you could use if you wanted, and that would be a special workshop item that was only available in interior cells. So if you wanted a workshop item that could only be built at Vault 88 or only at Home Plate, you could use that as your type. Power is going to be things that use electricity, so things like the mirror ball or the lighting. It does not include generators, so this is one of those categories where I think they created with the intention of doing something else with and didn't really go forward on. I find it's best to just stick with a couple of different categories, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Let me finish up this list. So then settlement, that is any settlement that acts as, or that's any workshop that acts as a settlement. So the difference would be home plate does not act as a settlement. There are no settlers there. Boston Airport also does not act as a settlement because there are no settlers there. So if you expect to have settlers, or if your particular item would need settlers, you definitely want to choose type settlement. The other good time, another good chance to choose a time to choose settlement is if it's an object you want to be built in either interior or exterior cells, but only if there's a settler there. So there are, I have no examples off the top of my head right now, but I'm sure you can think of something. And then the wire type you will literally never use. So what I find is best to do is just put everything either under settlement if it requires a settler, exterior if it wouldn't make any sense to build inside of a home, and then I put everything else under furniture if it's because those can account for basically anything interior and exterior. So you're going to want to just choose one of those types. We're going to choose for our outhouse, we're going to choose settlement because we're happy to have it built in, say, Vault 88 or in Sanctuary, but we don't want it to be built in a player home. That would be kind of awkward. All right, so then the rest of this stuff is essentially optional, but there are some reasons that you're going to want to fill some more of this stuff out. So for example, the sounds you could totally get away without, though players will find that weird. Recipe filter, this is one where I'm going to say it's required for the sake of this tutorial. There are reasons to do without a recipe filter in the future, but we'll cover that in a more advanced video. And then you have to have at least one item here in the required item list. So you don't have to make a substantial cost for your particular item, but if you have no cost, the game will not display that item as buildable. So really these two are required, but I'm going to call them soft requirements, and we'll go over that in a more advanced tutorial. So to start, let's set up a recipe filter. So the recipe filter is where your item is in workshop mode. So to find that, what we're going to do is we're going to click on, and actually before we do that, I'm going to teach you something new in the CK. And this is something that's going to happen throughout these tutorials, and I'm going to try and recover it in multiple because it doesn't really demand its own tutorial, but it's a useful thing to know, is that sometimes it's nice to have multiple object windows so that you can have multiple categories available. And you can, in any object window, you can right click on the right hand side and click create new object window, and that essentially just lets you have another copy of that to move, and you can have that act independently. So for example, we have our constructible object one over here because we want to build ourselves some workshop items, but we also want to have the recipe filters available so we can figure out where they go. So to do that, we're going to go down and expand the miscellaneous category, and then we're going to click on keyword, and then we're going to start typing in workshop recipe filter. And that will bring up all of the potential categories. And this does include, so it looks like that Bethesda has to include the categories for all of the DLC and the Creation Club content in here. So those menus apparently are available in the vanilla game, even if you don't own those particular things. Although I wouldn't recommend putting those in those things because that would be very confusing to the users of your mod. So I would stick with some of the ones that don't have the names, the word DLC, or let's see if we can find what the Creation Club one's called. Creation Club. Okay, so I would avoid the ones that have those particular names in them and stick to some of the other ones that you're used to seeing in the vanilla game. All right, so the first thing to know about the way these names are laid out is that they're done in such a way that you can tell how deep into the category it is based on the number on it, and that you should avoid using higher level categories as your filter. And that's confusing to say, so let's think about, so I'm going to just give you an example in practice. For example, if you look at this building category, that's the top level category. That holds all these other things, and you'll probably recognize some of these. So if you start looking down the list of the different things here, you'll see that there's barn, and then I'm looking at all the ones that have 02 next to them. So you see there's barn, and then brick, and then concrete, doors, elevators, fences. You probably recognize this and can think about how that goes in the game, of that after you go up to the building level in the menu, that you'll then find categories for doors, elevators, fences, etc. Well, you'll know that from playing in the game that when you go to building, all there are is categories. There's nothing else for you to build there, and that's by design. And so you want to avoid ever putting anything in the top level category. So if you ever see that below or next to a category, there's another copy of that exact name, but with a number, you should not put things in that particular category. So the same thing happens at multiple levels deep. So if you went to ball track in the CK, and this is definitely coming from a DLC. So let me find an example of one that is in the vanilla game. I believe wood would be a good one. Yeah. So if you go in the game and you go to building and then wood, you'll notice that there are no actual items to build there. There are just more categories, and you probably recognize the categories here: floor, miscellaneous, prefabs, roof, stairs, wall. So each time you find a category that seems like it might be perfect for the item that you're building, look and see if right below that there's another one with another number after it. So then that's basically saying, so the top level doesn't have a number, and then the second level deep has a 2, the third level deep has a 3, etc. And I think Bethesda doesn't go much beyond 4, but I could be mistaken on that. So essentially, you're going to find a lowest level a filter or lowest level category that makes sense. So the easiest way is, rather than worrying about this necessarily, is go, if you're not sure, if this is bending your mind for whatever reason, if my explanation is terrible, go into the game and just find a category that you would like, and then just try and figure it out from the names. Bethesda's pretty good about keeping the names very straightforward. And if you're ever unsure, if you open any one of these up, the actual name, and this is a perfect example of the building, the actual name that shows up in game is right here. It's display name. So for example, you might have gone into the game and been like, I want structures, and then you came in here and you can't find anywhere workshop recipe filter structures. That's because in the creation kit it's called building. And so this just takes a while to learn. Most of them match up perfectly with the names in here as they do in the game. But if you ever can't find one, just start double clicking on these and look for the display name. That'll be what you're used to finding in the game. So you're going to find a category. Like I said, the best way to do it is go in the game, find the one that you want that matches, and then find the corresponding one in here. And you can simply drag it in here. So we're going to go to, for our outhouse, we're going to go under, we want building and wood, and we're going to call it prefab. So we're going to go ahead and drag prefab in there, and that's it. Now that's all you needed to do to set this up. And something that's probably jumping into your heads is, can I use multiple recipe filters? And the answer is yes, but there's a caveat to it. Whenever you have multiple recipe filters, it will show up in both of those menus. But if the player stores your item, it will show up in one of them seemingly at random for them to rebuild. So it won't show up in both if it's stored. So that's just a little quirk to be aware of. All right, so the next thing we absolutely have to have for this to show up, and like I said, there are reasons to not have it, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to do it, is the required items. So this is your cost. This is what the player will have to pay out of either their inventory or out of their workbench. And what you'll do is you'll just right-click in here and hit New. And then for all of these, you're almost exclusively going to want to type in the following: C underscore. And those are the scrap records. So if you see the ones that start with C underscore, you're going to want to use not the ones that have scrap. You want to use the ones that just have the type CMPO, and that stands for component. So for example, if I choose scrap here instead of C acid, essentially what will happen is the only way the player will be able to build my item is if they have actual acid in their inventory. Whereas if it's the component type, they will be able to auto use any of their junk items that had acid in them. So the components are definitely what you want to use. There are rare cases where you might use items that aren't these C underscore components. For example, the shopkeeper stalls in the vanilla game use caps as well. And we'll cover that type of thing in the more advanced tutorials. But for now, I would work under the assumption that you're only going to use the records that start with C underscore and that are of type CMPO. And you'll recognize these. They're all the names of the type of stuff that you're used to seeing in workshop mode for the costs. And so we're going to just choose arbitrarily. So, and you can type in more in the filter, obviously. So I know what I want this to cost. So I want it to cost some wood. So we're going to say like 5 wood, and you can learn to balance this based on what the vanilla items cost. I don't think this is what I'm doing is particularly balanced, but I'm just trying to show this for the sake of demonstration. I think they tend to be very high in costs in the vanilla game, like a wooden platform costs like 12 wood or something, so it's probably needs to be a lot steeper than what I'm doing. But you basically you base it on whatever you feel. So if your item is particularly advanced and you want it to cost more advanced materials, you can do that. If it's just for the sake of decoration, you might want it to be cheaper. If you don't care about cost at all, you could do what I do for the Project Blueprint mods, which is I basically make everything cost either 1 steel or 1 wood, since those are the cheapest and most easily attainable materials, and it's totally fine. So if you're not worried about the balance of it, you can just make it cost 1 of a particular thing. And then I guess we'll also add our thing should cost, and I can't think of what it's called now, so we're gonna flip through the list here. Ceramic for that toilet. So we're gonna make they're gonna need 3 ceramic as well. So that's what our outhouse costs. And you can put a description in here, and this will show up in the build menu. I would be careful about going too long with your descriptions, because the game will automatically shrink the text to fit within a certain area. So I would limit yourself to, maybe 10 or less words here. I'm not going to bother. I think people know what an outhouse is. And that's it. So if I were to hit OK right now, we could go in the game and this would be buildable. I'm a completionist though, so we're going to finish this up by setting up these sounds. So all of the sounds that you're used to hearing right now are, you can find those under UI Workshop Mode Item. And you will see that there are a bunch of pickup and put down sounds. So you just find the one that feels like it would match best. So there's only a small collection. It's not super important. When I am building a whole bunch of workshop items, I tend to just pick one and make them all the same. We'll make this wood medium. It's not a large. Like large to me would be a prefab, so we'll go wood medium. And then for the put down sound, it should keep the filter in. Yeah, it did. And we'll do put down wood medium. So now we've got our sound set up. We don't want any conditions. We want this to be available right away. And we are all good to go here. So the one field, or the 2 fields we skipped that we didn't talk about at all, menu art object and match conditions, we'll cover those in more advanced tutorials. They're not required for this. And then so once we hit OK, it's going to create our constructible object that's there. And I have a couple of menus open over here. So one thing that's going to happen if you guys don't see it on screen, if I hit save though, you're going to get this warning here if you have any of your boxes open, which is very unfortunate. I really wish that they would get rid of this in the creation kit. But if you try and save when you have another window open, you can have these object windows open, and you can have the default like layer and render. But if you have any particular form open, like for example, if you have another constructible object open that you were referencing, it is going to give you this and require you to close those out. So I'm going to close all these forms I have off on my other monitor, and then I should be able to save. All right, there we go. So next we're going to cut, and I'll show you in game that this thing is indeed buildable. All right, guys, we are in the game. Now, I'm assuming you know how to load your own plugin, and that's why we skipped that step. If you don't, you're definitely going to want to go check out the CK101 tutorial, because that's probably the one of the most important things you're going to need to know if you're going to want to build mods. So you're going to go to the category that you decided to put your item in. I put mine under structures, wood, prefabs, and there it is. And you can see that my cost matches up exactly what I set in the creation kit. And one thing for those of you who followed the CK102 tutorial, you'll notice that my item is sitting on the ground nicely, and that's because I put that static pivot dummy down at the bottom there. And you also see that when I rotate, it rotates around the center, as you would expect. It's rotating around where that static dummy was. And for those of you who didn't do that, don't worry about it. If you're interested, go watch the 102 tutorial, which will teach you how to make your own custom kit bashed models. And we can place this, and you'll see it acts just like a normal workshop item. So, I can highlight it. It's got the name up in the corner there. You can see that it's got all the details. It's got the things I put in. You can walk inside of it. It works exactly like you'd expect for a workshop item to work. Now, there are some little caveats and things you're going to run into issues with these. For example, settlers probably won't path into this, and that's the type of thing we'll cover in the more advanced tutorials. So I would say go forth, make yourself some cool workshop items, take vanilla items, turn those into buildable items. There's a couple of reasons I wanted to start with this. One is that I think most of you who follow me probably are interested in the settlement system, and so are most players who still play Fallout 4 to this day. I think that's one of the big things that drives people to keep playing this game over and over again. And so, while I've mentioned in videos past that one of the things you need to do to keep driving yourself forward is keep getting stuff in the game to motivate yourself, another way to motivate yourself is to get people to like your stuff. And so these are probably the easiest mods you can build that will have fairly mass appeal, especially if you have a good collection of decent items that are well planned out. You will definitely see a lot of downloads. And using the methods I've shown you of using either copies of vanilla objects or of taking static collections, you can actually release these on all 3 platforms. So these are eligible for release on Xbox, PS4, and PC. So this is a great way to get some downloads under your belt if you are an externally motivated person, if you get motivated by likes and thumbs up from other people, which I think most of us do to some extent, that this is a great way for you to do that right away without having to learn anything more, other than you'll need to learn how to actually upload a mod, which there are plenty of tutorials out for that, and I will cover that eventually. The other thing I want to mention before we end this video is if you run into weird problems, so things like I mentioned with the settlers, or if you're trying to get into more advanced stuff, we will cover all of those things in future tutorials. I have a lot of knowledge on workshop items to share with you all, so if you have questions or you run into a problem, feel free to comment below, and I'll try to make sure that your particular concern gets addressed in a future video, if not outright responding to your comment to tell you what you've got to do right there, if it's a simple enough thing I can answer. All right, guys. Take care and enjoy the tutorials.